Hey y'all, Dr. Keisha Green here, and welcome to Lesson 4 of the Culturally Responsive Teaching 101 course. This lesson will center around the topic of addressing bias. In this lesson, we will define bias, go over types of bias, learn how to address bias, and learn how to confront bias. By the end of this lesson, learners should be able to define what bias means and articulate what the different types of bias are, connect the information gained to their own teaching practice, describe 3 steps for addressing bias, and evaluate their own teaching practice and understand how to grow it to be more centered around addressing bias. We will begin this lesson with a scenario. Miss Sally and Mr. Jim are both ninth grade teachers. Miss Sally teaches ninth grade math and Mr. Jim teaches ninth grade reading. They both have a student named Tom. Mr. Jim also taught Tom's older brother, George, who was a bit of a troublemaker in class. George would often rarely complete his homework and would regularly disrupt the class. Tom looks exactly like his older brother, George. In class, Mr. Jim would be very coarse with Tom and would never call on him during the lesson. Miss Sally saw that Tom was a hardworking student who never disrupted the class and seemed to have the correct answer each time he was called upon. One day, Mr. Jim and Miss Sally were in the teacher's lounge talking about Tom. Miss Sally was very surprised to hear Mr. Jim's thoughts about the student. Given that Mr. Jim held a negative perception of George, he imposed that perception onto Tom. The carryover of the sentiments about George being placed onto Tom demonstrate bias. Mr. Jim held a bias that because Tom was George's brother, Tom was also going to exhibit the same behaviors that George did. Bias is defined as having an unfair judgment, assumption, or prejudice geared towards an individual or a collective community. Bias stems from stereotypes or the belief that certain groups of people have specific characteristics because of their race, ethnicity, ability or disability, sexual orientation, gender, linguistic abilities, or other identifiers, or in Mr. Jim's case, from past experiences. Bias comes in 2 main forms. Bias is either explicit or it is implicit. Explicit bias is consciously held, meaning that a person is aware of or knows that they have certain attitudes or thoughts about a person or a group. Implicit bias, however, is subconsciously held, meaning that a person is not aware that they have certain attitudes or thoughts about a group or an individual. Explicit bias often has intention, whereas implicit bias is something that takes place often unintentionally. In Mr. Jim's case, his previous experience with a student caused him to exhibit implicit bias towards Tom. Mr. Jim was unaware of the sentiments he held, which means that they were subconscious and not consciously known. The key is to remain aware of your biases and to try to prevent biases from influencing your actions as an educator. In order for this to occur, educators should begin addressing bias. Now that you have an understanding of the different types of bias and how bias is defined, we are going to explore how one can address their own bias. To grow and change as an educator, you need to be aware of what biases are and how they impact your teaching practice and actions in the classroom or the learning environment. One key step in addressing bias is beginning to acknowledge that everyone experiences bias. The respective bias may be large and influences a great deal of a person's beliefs, or the respective bias may be very small and is only seen every so often. I want you to take the time to think about an interaction with a colleague or a peer. How did you feel about this individual? Did you have positive sentiments about this person or negative sentiments? Did you feel comfortable talking with this person or did you feel awkward? I want you to think about 3 words that best describe that individual. Were the words you thought of mostly positive or were they negative? All of those aspects and those unspoken perceptions work to influence the interactions that you have with that individual. The next step to address bias requires self-reflection and identification of your own bias. To do this, one needs to begin to question the reason or the motivation for why they might exhibit a specific answer or give a certain response in the situations that they encounter throughout their day. It is important to think about the reasons you might have responded to an individual one way and another person in a completely different manner. It's important for you to hold awareness of why certain individuals might elicit certain thoughts from you compared to other individuals that might elicit certain thoughts or actions from you. The key is to begin to develop awareness or consciousness of the practices or actions that you conduct that are rooted in the biases you hold. After gaining more confidence with addressing and holding awareness of your own bias, the final step involves you confronting your own bias. Let's return to Miss Sally and Mr. Jim. Miss Sally has been having another conversation with Mr. Jim about Tom, the student that they both teach. During the conversation, Mr. Jim told Miss Sally that although Tom has not acted out yet, he is sure that Tom will become a handful during the semester because Tom's brother George was a handful and the two probably act the same. Miss Sally questioned Mr. Jim and asked him why he held that perception. She then also shared that Tom followed the expectations in class and actually was very quiet. Upon reflecting, Mr. Jim realized that he had judged Tom solely because Tom was George's brother. Mr. Jim realized and recognized that he held some implicit biases about the siblings. In the real world, the biases that arrive might revolve around more difficult topics. Some individuals, including yourself, might not be able to easily see the biases that exist. Despite this, it is important to question and understand why you or someone else might be exhibiting specific actions or behaviors. Confronting bias occurs both internally and externally. Internally, one must reflect on, question, and analyze why they might be responding to a situation or perceiving a student in a certain manner. We are all predisposed to think and respond to different people in different manners, whether we are aware of our actions or not. Our past experiences have shaped how we view the world and the actions or responses that we will produce. As an educator, you should take the time to develop the habit to stop and reflect about why you might be producing a response with one student and possibly a different response with another student. Educators should take the time to ask themselves what characteristics about a student or a colleague might be eliciting a certain reaction and why. By questioning your own actions in the classroom, it will allow you to confront bias through actively addressing any implicit or hidden reasons for why you might be responding in the manner that you are. Externally, you may begin to see the bias in others. You can help others begin to become more aware of their own bias through asking them to reflect on their actions and to question the reasons that might be underneath them exhibiting certain behaviors. It is important to engage in open discussion with your colleagues and with students around the perceptions that they hold and to ask them to compare the perceptions that they have with those of others. Through taking the time to confront bias both internally and externally, you as an educator will work to grow and be the best that you can be for your students. As educators, to grow our teaching practice, it is important that we take the insights we gain and connect them and use them to inform our own teaching practice. I want you to pause and think about how you can address bias and confront bias, and how doing so and centering your teaching practice around it might positively impact the learning experiences of your students in the future. On the next slide, you will find the references that were used to shape this lesson, and at the end of this video, you will find the discussion board number 5 question. So once you are done with your self-reflection, please continue on and be sure to answer the discussion board question in the comment section. I thank you for being here, and I will see you in the next lesson video.